Hey guys, welcome back to a new video on the channel. My name is Jack.F, I'm a freelance videographer, photographer and video editor, producing weekly content and helping you take your video editing and videography to that next level. So if that's something you are interested in, stay tuned and subscribe to the channel. Now, I've been away from the channel for some time. I'm finally back doing these regular videos. I've got a new setup, I've moved into a new place, and I just want to do a quick announcement before we get into this video. I'm doing something very, very special over the next 2 to 3 months. For you guys, I'm going to be setting something up. I can't give too much information away straight away, but just keep an eye out on the channel. I'm going to be announcing it over the next month or two. So keep an eye out on the channel and stay tuned for that. Now, going to jump straight into this video. The basics of videography in under 10 minutes. Let's go. So the basics of videography is you've got to understand the camera first. There's 3 elements to controlling the camera. The ISO, which is basically how sensitive the light, the sensor is to light. The higher you go, the more sensitive it is to light. The lower you go, the less sensitive it is to light. The aperture, that's basically the little hole. I don't know how to describe it. It's a little hole. The lower you go down, the wider the hole and the more blurry the background. That's how when you see a couple of videos or photos, it's got that really nice blurry background. That's because it's on a very low aperture, like a 1.2, 1.4 or 1.8 aperture. And this final element is shutter speed. Shutter speed is basically how fast the shutter is closing and opening. With that out of the way, if you want to go more in depth on that, I'll link a video up there to a video I've done in the past that goes over the more basics of, the proper basics of the camera. But that's basically it for the basics of the camera, more towards videography now. The first main thing is frame rate. So the frame rate is sectioned off into 2 main parts. You've got recorded frame rate and playback frame rate. Basically, captured frame rate, recorded frame rate is how fast, what you set your camera frame rate as. So if you set your camera at 60 FPS, it's going to record in 60 FPS. It's going to record 60 frames within 1 second. If you set your camera to 24 frames per second, it's going to record 24 frames in 1 second. I know that's a lot of frames. And more modern cameras go up to like 120, 240 and above. And the higher you go, the more slow motion it's going to get. So we'll come back to that. And the second type is playback FPS. That is what you see when you watch a movie in the cinema, or you're playing it back on your editing software. So if you shoot in 60 frames per second and you put your timeline as 24 frames per second, it's going to have a nice slow motion to it, because it's doubled of what it's being played back as. So if you slow that footage down, it's going to have more frames to fall back, and it's going to be a nice slow motion, buttery smooth footage. And 24 frames per second is the industry standard, so you always want to be editing and setting your timeline as 24 frames per second. But the more higher you go in frames per second, the more quality, the more slow motion like quality you're going to get out of the footage. So if you shoot in 120 frames per second, you put that into a 24 FPS timeline, it's going to take longer to play out those frames. So 120 divided by 24 is 5. It's going to take the footage, the time, 5 times longer to play that footage out. So basically, the higher you record it, the higher frame rate you're recording, and it's going to be more fluid slow motion. So the third part to understanding the camera is the shutter speed. So there's a golden rule with the shutter speed. You always want to have it double the frame rate. The reason for this is because the shutter speed controls the motion blur. No matter what shutter speed you're shooting in, you always want to have it double, because that's the most natural to the human eye. So if for instance, I'm shooting in 30 frames per second at the moment, I've got my shutter speed, 60 shutter speed. That's because, again, it's the most natural to the human eye. If I was to go lower than that, if I was to go to like 1/20, the motion blur would be very choppy, it would be very blurry. You often see this done in films where the character is on drugs or they're drunk, and you see that kind of staggered, motion blur. So the lower you go, the more motion blur you're going to get, but the opposite is true. The higher you go, the more crisp and the less motion blur you're going to get. So if I'm shooting at 30 frames per second and I put my shutter speed at 1/120, it's going to be a very crisp image, but it's not going to have any motion blur, and it's going to look weird like it is for when it's a lower shutter speed. So you always want to have it double the frame rate. So the next part to understanding videography is an ND filter. Basically what an ND filter is basically sunglasses for your camera. So if you're shooting outside or you're shooting in a very bright place, you're going to have to lower down your ISO, and you can't lower down or increase your shutter speed because it's got to remain double. You can't lower or increase your shutter speed because it's got to stay the same. It's got to stay double your FPS. And you can't really mess around with your aperture, because if you want to get that nice blurry background, you've got to leave it at 2.8, 1.8. You've got to leave it at a low aperture. So then that just leads to the ISO, and if you crank it down to 100 and it's still overexposed, this is where an ND filter comes in. Basically, it's just sunglasses, like basically how it functions for humans, but it's the same for the camera. It filters out the light and it reduces the amount of light that's being let in, and you can adjust how much, how intense the ND filter is for each lens. But it's basically what an ND filter is. It filters the light so you don't have to compensate with your in-camera settings. And the final part to videography, I know we're flying through this, the final part is camera movements, and camera movements is broken down into two things. The movement of the actual camera, for instance this can be a pan. Pan is when you look left and right but the camera is stationary. A tilt is when it looks up and down but it's stationary. A push in, a pull out, a dolly zoom. There's a lot of different motions. And then you've got the camera gear as well. And some basics of the camera gear is a gimbal. You see this in corporate videos, especially in property videos as well. It creates that nice smooth footage without any jiggeriness to it. It's just a nice smooth shot, and it's a motorized gimbal. It's motorized, it's balanced on both sides, so the camera is just flat. No matter which way you push it up, down, left, right, it's still going to be level, and it's going to have a nice smooth motion to it. A little bit more motion, you've got what's called a shoulder rig, and what a shoulder rig is, it's in between handheld and a gimbal. And what a shoulder rig does, it's a rig like this, but it's pressed up against your shoulder. You've got a little shoulder grip here, it goes against your shoulder, and you've got two grips here, and you can move it like you can do anything with it. But it's, like I said, it's in between a gimbal and handheld. And onto the final one is obviously handheld. You want to use handheld, say if you want to do like a POV drunk shot or something, or you just woken up. It's handheld, self-explanatory, so you hold the camera in your hand. And with the different camera gear, you can use the different types of camera movement, push in, push out, rotate, all that sort of good stuff. But that's been the basics of videography under 10 minutes. I sure hope this is under 10 minutes. That's been me, that's been the basics of videography in under 10 minutes. If you like what you see here, subscribe to the channel and check out some of my other videos. I'm going to be coming out with a full Adobe Premiere Pro breakdown crash course, so stay out for that. That's a big project I'm working on at the moment. I've had a lot of you comment, Jack, can we get more Adobe Premiere Pro tutorials? Instead of just doing, a little ones here and there, I'm going to be making a big 3-4 hour crash course for you guys. Put it on the channel completely free, and yes, so you can learn Adobe Premiere Pro. And like I said, I'm working on something very big for the channel. Keep an eye on the channel. It's going to be, it's going to be a lot of value for you guys. So keep an eye out for that. I'll be announcing that in the coming months. But apart from that, if you like what you see here, subscribe to the channel. And that's been me, Jack.F. See you later, guys. Thanks.